Think your dinner is a little boring? Is that leftover pizza in the fridge feeling like a tragedy? Well, let's take a trip back to a time when your most basic meal would have been a feast, and the idea of food safety was pretty much science fiction. We're not talking about romanticized castle banquets here. This is the real, gritty, and often disgusting truth about what people, from the poorest peasant to the richest noble, were actually eating. This is why food in the medieval period could be genuinely awful. We all think of bread as the staff of life, right? It's simple, it's comforting. But for many people in the Middle Ages, bread was a different story. It could be a hard, gritty loaf that wore down your teeth. And on a bad day, that same loaf of bread could make an entire village sick, causing convulsions and terrifying hallucinations. So, let's start with the most basic food of all, and find out why the staff of life was sometimes anything but. For the vast majority of the medieval population, grain was everything. Peasants relied on barley, oats, and rye, while wheat was a more expensive treat. This all usually ended up as bread, but it wasn't the kind of bread we know. The typical peasant loaf, often called maslin bread, was a dark, dense, and heavy brick made from a mix of whatever grains were available. The first problem often started at the mill. A peasant usually couldn't grind their own grain, they had to use the lord's mill and pay a fee. These mills used massive stone wheels, or quernstones, and as they ground away, little bits of sand and grit would chip off right into the flour. This meant that a lot of bread had an abrasive, gritty texture. Archaeologists who've studied medieval skeletons have found teeth that are worn down horribly, sometimes right to the nerve, which is a direct result of chewing on gritty food day after day. This led to terrible dental infections and abscesses, which could be deadly in a world without antibiotics. But a broken tooth wasn't the only risk. While most millers were regulated by guilds, a dishonest one might try to stretch the flour by adding things like chalk or sawdust, making the bread even worse. The most frightening danger, however, was a fungus called claviceps purpurea, better known as ergot. It could grow on rye, especially after a cold, wet winter, and it contains powerful toxins that aren't destroyed by baking. Eating bread contaminated with ergot led to a horrifying condition called ergotism, which the Middle Ages called St. Anthony's fire. It came in two forms. The first, convulsive ergotism, attacked the nervous system, causing terrible muscle spasms, tremors, and vivid hallucinations. Some historians even theorize that certain outbreaks of mass hysteria or accusations of witchcraft might have been linked to a whole village accidentally eating tainted rye. The second form was gangrenous ergotism. The toxins restrict blood flow, especially to your hands and feet. Victims felt an intense burning pain, like their limbs were on fire. Then, their fingers and toes would turn black, shrivel up, and eventually just fall off. While these outbreaks weren't happening everywhere all the time, epidemics of St. Anthony's fire did sweep through different regions over the centuries, killing many people. To think that your daily bread, the very thing you needed to survive, could be the cause of so much suffering is just incredible. The nobility, of course, ate much better bread. Theirs was called manchet, made from the finest, whitest wheat flour that was sifted multiple times to get rid of any grit. It was a soft, white symbol of their status, a world away from the dark, heavy loaves of the poor. So, if the bread could be a bit of a hazard, what did you eat with it? For most people, for almost every meal, the answer was pottage. Now, this wasn't always a thick, hearty stew. In its most basic form, pottage was a thin gruel. You'd have a pot over the fire with a base of water or thin broth, thickened with some oats or barley. Then you'd throw in whatever vegetables you had from your garden, usually things like cabbage, onions, and leeks. If you were lucky, maybe some carrots or turnips. For many, these vegetables were one of the only sources of vitamins in their diet. The main feature of pottage was its monotony. Spices were incredibly expensive, so a peasant might only have common herbs like parsley or mustard to add a little flavor. The texture was often a soft mush, since the ingredients were boiled for hours, sometimes even for days. In fact, one of the most interesting things about peasant pottage was that the pot was rarely emptied. It just kept simmering over the fire. You'd eat from it, and then toss new ingredients in to top it off. This created a kind of perpetual stew. It was a clever way to always have a warm meal ready, but the idea of eating from a stew that's been going for days is a little unsettling to us. While the constant simmering would have killed most dangerous bacteria, it still highlights the resourcefulness required to get by. This diet, heavy on carbs from bread and light on everything else, was often low in protein and iron, which led to widespread anemia and other health problems. Archaeological evidence shows that malnutrition was a common problem for ordinary people. The pottage kept them from starving, but it didn't always provide the energy they needed for a life of hard labor. The rich ate pottage too, but theirs was a different thing entirely, often a thick, meat-filled stew called amorous, enriched with eggs, expensive spices, and almonds. For everyone else, though, the simple, watery pottage was just a fact of life. So what about meat? This is where the difference between the rich and poor becomes a massive canyon. For a peasant, fresh meat was a rare luxury. A peasant family might raise a pig on scraps, but that pig was a huge asset. It would probably be slaughtered in the fall, and most of the meat would be sold or given to the lord as rent. The little that was left for the family had to be heavily salted to preserve it. The idea of frying up a fresh pork chop was a fantasy. Cattle were even more valuable for milk and plowing, so beef was incredibly rare for the poor. Chickens provided precious eggs, but you'd only eat the bird itself once it was too old to lay, meaning the meat was tough and stringy. And what about all the animals in the forest? The deer, boar, and rabbits all legally belonged to the landowner. If a peasant was caught poaching, the punishments were brutal, a chopped-off hand for a rabbit, or blinding for a deer. The forest was full of food that a starving peasant could only look at. Their protein mostly came from dairy, beans, and peas. The meat they did eat was often awful, the undesirable bits like intestines, brains, and feet that the rich didn't want. Now, compare that to the nobility. Their problem wasn't a lack of meat, it was a ridiculous overabundance of it. A noble feast was pure theater. They ate venison, boar, beef, and pork, but also almost anything that could be caught, swans, peacocks, herons, even porpoises. Presentation was key. A swan would be cooked, then carefully put back into its own skin and feathers to be served at the table as a spectacle. Chefs would even create wild mashups, like sewing the front half of a pig to the back half of a chicken, roasting it, and serving it as a mythical cockatrice. And the flavor? It was all about showing off wealth. A pound of nutmeg cost as much as 7 oxen. Noble food was drenched in spices like cinnamon, cloves, and saffron. The main point wasn't just flavor, it was to scream, "I am rich." They also loved mixing sweet and savory, so you'd get meat dishes loaded with sugar and fruit. While spices were mostly for status and flavor, they could also help cover the taste of meat that wasn't perfectly fresh, but even the wealthy weren't immune to food poisoning from meat that had started to turn. With all that food, you'd get thirsty. But just grabbing a glass of water could be a risky move. Public sanitation wasn't really a thing. Rivers and wells, especially in towns, were often contaminated with all sorts of waste, carrying diseases like dysentery and cholera. Drinking water was a gamble. That's why the default drink for almost everyone, including children, was beer or ale. This was mostly small beer, with a very low alcohol content. The key was that the brewing process involved boiling the water, which killed off most of the germs, making it a much safer bet than the local well. Of course, just like with flour, a shady brewer might water it down to make more profit. For the rich, the drink of choice was wine, another expensive, imported status symbol. Beyond the drinks, the biggest problem looming over all food was the complete lack of refrigeration. You had to preserve food or eat it quickly. The most common method was packing meat and fish in barrels of salt. It worked, but it made the food intensely salty. You'd have to soak it in fresh water for hours, sometimes days, just to make it edible, and even then the texture was often tough and leathery. Smoking, drying, and pickling were other common strategies. People had to rely on their senses. If it smelled or looked bad, you knew it was a risk. But without any concept of germs, foodborne illness was just a constant, accepted part of life. Everyone, from the peasant to the king, was playing a dangerous game with every bite of food that wasn't perfectly fresh. So when you look at the whole picture, from the gritty bread and monotonous pottage of the peasants to the over-the-top, spice-drenched feasts of the nobles, the medieval food world was full of challenges. It was a world of monotony, nutritional gaps, and real danger. Your diet was a direct reflection of your place in a harsh society, one without sanitation, refrigeration, or a modern understanding of health. Every meal was a reminder of that reality. So the next time you look in your fridge and can't find anything you want to eat, just take a second. Appreciate the safety, the variety, and the incredible quality we all take for granted. Because you are, without a doubt, eating better than any medieval king ever did. If you found this look back at history fascinating, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. And let us know in the comments, which medieval food sounds the absolute worst to you. Thanks for watching.